Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Nova Chronicles. Before money, before iron, before writing, there was salt. Not salt as a seasoning. Not the white grains in the shaker on your kitchen table, so abundant and so cheap that it has become one of the least considered substances in any modern household. Purchased in bulk, used without thought, thrown away without ceremony. Salt as power. Salt as currency. Salt as the substance that determined which cities would rise, and which would remain nothing more than a collection of huts on a patch of ground that no trade route would ever bother to cross. Salt as the reason that armies marched and wars were fought and empires drew their boundaries in the specific places they did rather than the places that geography alone would have suggested. Salt as the force that built civilization. This is the misconception to release tonight. The idea that salt is a minor thing, a domestic convenience, a background flavor in the food you eat without thinking about it. Salt is not minor. Salt is, in the full span of human history, one of the most consequential substances the earth has ever produced. More consequential, in terms of its direct influence on where human beings settled, how they traded, what they fought over, and how they organized the political and economic systems that eventually produced the world you are lying in tonight, than gold, than iron, than almost any other physical substance except water. Empires rose on salt, and fell when they lost control of it. The salt you carry in your body right now, the approximately 250 grams of sodium chloride dissolved in your blood and your cellular fluid and your tears and your sweat, is not a seasoning. It is a structural requirement. Without it, your neurons cannot fire. Your muscles cannot contract. Your kidneys cannot filter. Your cells cannot maintain the precise electrochemical gradient across their membranes that makes every biological process in your body possible. Salt is not something your body uses. Salt is something your body is. A saline solution maintained at a specific concentration by a regulatory system so precise and so continuous that it operates below the level of conscious awareness every moment of every day of your life. You are salt water. You have always been salt water. Every cell in your body is bathed in a solution whose salt concentration reflects, with remarkable fidelity, the salt concentration of the ancient ocean in which the first cells evolved. Your body maintains its internal salt environment at approximately 9 grams of sodium chloride per liter, a concentration that, diluted slightly for the specific ionic balance of seawater, approximates the chemistry of the Cambrian Ocean, the ocean that existed 500 million years ago when your distant ancestors first developed the cellular machinery that your body still runs. You carry the ancient ocean inside you, in your blood, in your tears, in the slight salt taste of sweat on your skin after a long day, and the history of how human beings obtained the salt their bodies demanded, the routes they walked, the mines they dug, the seawater they evaporated, the wars they fought, the taxes they imposed, the trade networks they built across thousands of kilometers of difficult terrain, is a history that reaches from the first animal to walk on land in search of a salt lick, all the way to the moment, approximately 8,000 years ago in the Neolithic period of human prehistory, when people first learned to deliberately produce and store salt in quantities large enough to trade. 8,000 years of salt history, beginning in a place that no longer looks like what it was. Detectives looking at the oldest known salt production site on Earth revealed that it was not beside the sea, where most people would expect salt production to begin, given that seawater is the most obvious source of dissolved sodium chloride on the planet's surface. It was beside a salt spring in the mountains of what is now Romania, a site called Lunca, in the Moldavian region, where a natural spring brings salt-saturated water to the surface from the salt deposits buried in the rock below, and where the people of the Neolithic Cucutini Tripilia culture were boiling that spring water in ceramic vessels to evaporate it and crystallize the salt as early as 6,000 years ago. 6,000 years ago, before the wheel, before bronze, before the first cities of Mesopotamia had grown beyond small agricultural settlements, before the pyramids were imagined. 6,000 years ago, in a mountain village in what is now Romania, People were producing salt with deliberate, organized, industrial intent, boiling brine in pots over fires, collecting the crystallized salt, storing it, and presumably trading it to communities that had no local salt source of their own. The salt trade is older than writing, older than the first recorded laws, older than the first coins, older than the first empires. It was running as a network of exchange connecting communities across hundreds of kilometers of prehistoric Europe before anyone had thought to record it, which means that everything we know about it comes not from documents, but from the things detectives looking at ancient sites have found in the ground. Ceramic fragments stained with the specific chemical signature of brine evaporation. Animal bones showing the butchery marks of carcasses preserved in salt for transport. The concentration of high-status grave goods at sites that sat on salt trade routes. The material evidence of wealth accumulating in the hands of people who controlled something everyone needed. Salt made the first rich people rich. Tonight we are going to follow salt. From the ancient ocean that created the world's salt deposits, through the mines and the evaporation pans and the trade routes and the wars and the taxes and the revolutions, all the way to the precise moment when salt arrives in you. In your blood, in your neurons, in the electrochemical signals that are, right now, becoming quieter and slower and more widely spaced as your nervous system begins its nightly transition from the sharp, quick, salt-mediated signaling of wakefulness toward the deep, slow, restored chemistry of sleep. This is salt. Not the word, not the shaker, the force, geological, biological, historical, economic, that shaped the world you live in and the body you live in and the chemistry that is, right now, carrying you toward rest. If this quiet journey is useful to you tonight, a slow hour of salt and deep time and the ancient, patient chemistry of a substance that has been doing its essential work since before life existed, then I would gently invite you to subscribe, or to leave a thought below about which part of this stays with you. It helps other people who are lying in their own salt water bodies in the dark, also trying to let the day's sharp edges dissolve into something smoother, find their way here, one crystal at a time. But for now, there is only this. Allow your shoulders to soften. Let your breathing slow, not forced, not measured, just allowed to find the pace it finds when the body's salt regulation system is working perfectly and nothing is asking it to work harder than it needs to. Let your attention settle into the long, patient, geological history of the most essential mineral on Earth. The salt was here before you. It will be here after. Tonight it is carrying you. Let's begin. 6 million years ago, the Mediterranean Sea disappeared. Not gradually, not in the slow, imperceptible way that sea levels rise and fall over geological time, the way ice ages lock water in glaciers and release it again across thousands of years of gradual change. The Mediterranean disappeared in what geologists, when they first assembled the evidence for it in the 1970s, described as one of the most extraordinary geological events of the last 50 million years. An event so dramatic, so complete, and so consequential for the subsequent history of life in the region that it left a physical record in the rock that is, once you know how to read it, as legible as a sentence written in a language you understand. The evidence is a layer of salt. Specifically, a layer of evaporite deposits, the minerals that precipitate from seawater when the water evaporates and leaves its dissolved salts behind, stretching across the entire floor of the Mediterranean basin, in some places reaching a thickness of 3 kilometers. 3 kilometers of salt, gypsum, and associated evaporite minerals, laid down in the relatively brief geological interval between approximately 6 million and 5.3 million years ago, during a period called the Messinian salinity crisis. 3 kilometers of salt, on the floor of what is now a sea. To understand how this happened requires understanding the geography of the Mediterranean's connection to the global ocean. The Mediterranean is not an open ocean. It is a semi-enclosed basin, a nearly landlocked sea connected to the Atlantic Ocean only through the narrow strait at its western end, the gap between what is now Spain and Morocco, where the Atlantic flows in to replace the water the Mediterranean loses to evaporation. In the modern ocean, That connection is maintained by the Strait of Gibraltar. But 6 million years ago, the tectonic collision between Africa and Europe had not yet fully opened the strait, and the connections that did exist between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic were progressively closed by tectonic uplift and falling global sea levels until, approximately 6 million years ago, the last connection closed. The Mediterranean was sealed, and with no inflow to replace the water it lost to evaporation under the intense solar radiation of the subtropical climate, it began to shrink. Slowly at first, then faster as the surface area decreased and the concentration of dissolved salts increased, and the increasingly dense, salty water evaporated less readily, but the net loss of water continued, year by year, decade by decade, millennium by millennium. Detectives looking at the sediment cores from the Mediterranean floor and the salt deposits exposed in the mountains of Sicily and Calabria revealed the sequence of what happened. The sea shrank to a series of hypersaline lakes saltier than the Dead Sea, saltier than any body of water currently existing on Earth's surface, in which nothing could survive except the most extreme halophilic bacteria. And then, as those lakes continued to shrink, they evaporated entirely in some areas, leaving the bare salt pan of the exposed Mediterranean floor, a landscape that sat, at its deepest point, approximately 5 kilometers below sea level. 5 kilometers below sea level. Dry. The deepest dry land the Earth has produced in the last 50 million years. A valley so deep that if you stood on its floor and looked up, the walls would rise higher above you than the height of the Himalayan peaks, except those walls were not rock. They were the former shores of a sea that had evaporated, and the sky above was not the sky of a mountain summit, but the sky of the deepest basin on the planet's surface, hot and still and thick with the salt haze of an evaporating world. Your body loses approximately 3 to 5 grams of salt per liter of sweat during heavy exercise. If you were transported to the floor of the evaporating Mediterranean 6 million years ago, the hottest, driest, most salt-saturated landscape the Earth has produced in recent geological time, your body's salt regulation system would be overwhelmed within hours. The rate of salt loss through sweating in that environment would exceed the rate at which any available food or water source could replace it. The evaporating Mediterranean was a landscape that would kill you by stealing your salt. And then, approximately 5.3 million years ago, in an event called the Zanclean Flood, the Atlantic broke through. Not slowly. Through a breach in the western barrier that, according to the most recent modeling of the event, may have started as a small channel but grew, as the water carved through the relatively soft sedimentary rock, with accelerating speed. Water flowing through a channel erodes the channel wider. The wider the channel, the more water flows. The more water flows, the faster the erosion. The Zanclean Flood, the refilling of the Mediterranean, may have progressed from a trickle to a cataract in decades or centuries, filling the 5-kilometer-deep basin with Atlantic seawater at a rate that modelers estimate could have raised the Mediterranean's level by up to 10 meters per day at the flood's peak. 10 meters per day. The entire Mediterranean, 3.7 million square kilometers of sea floor, refilled in a period estimated at between several hundred years and several thousand years. An eye blink in geological time. A catastrophe of water arriving in a landscape that had been dry, salt-covered, and apparently permanent for nearly 1 million years. And the salt it left behind, the 3 kilometers of evaporite deposits laid down during the million years of the Messinian salinity crisis, was buried beneath the returning sea, compressed by the weight of water and subsequent sediment above it, and then, over the subsequent millions of years, subjected to the one physical property of rock salt that makes it one of the most geologically active minerals on Earth. Salt flows under sufficient pressure and temperature, the pressure of several kilometers of overlying rock, the temperature of the deep crust. Rock salt does not behave like other minerals. It behaves like an extremely viscous fluid. It deforms plastically, flowing slowly through the surrounding rock under the influence of pressure differences, moving from areas of high pressure toward areas of lower pressure, rising toward the surface through the rock above it in columns and domes and sheets that reshape the geology of the crust above them. This is called salt tectonics. And it is the monster of salt geology, not the mineral's chemical properties or its biological importance, but its mechanical behavior under pressure. Salt that flows. Salt that pierces the rock above it. Salt that creates the underground structures, the salt domes, that trap the oil and gas deposits that have shaped the economic and political history of the modern world. The salt domes of the Gulf of Mexico, of the North Sea, of the Persian Gulf, the geological structures that petroleum geologists learned to recognize as traps for hydrocarbons in the early 20th century, are the surface expressions of salt that has been moving slowly through the crust since it was deposited in ancient evaporite events and compressed beneath the weight of subsequent geological history. The salt is still moving. Right now, in the subsurface of the Gulf of Mexico and the Zagros Mountains of Iran and the Saharan Atlas of Algeria, salt deposited in ancient seas is flowing upward through the crust at rates of millimeters to centimeters per year, reshaping the rock above it, creating the geological structures that determine where oil accumulates and where it does not. Detectives looking at the Wieliczka salt mine in Poland, the oldest continuously operating salt mine in the world, with galleries extending to a depth of 327 meters beneath the surface of the Krakow plain, revealed something in its stratigraphy that connects the slow tectonics of moving salt to the human history that salt enabled. The salt at Wieliczka was deposited approximately 13.5 million years ago, when a shallow inland sea covered the region that is now southern Poland. That sea evaporated. Its salt settled to the floor. The salt was buried, compressed, and deformed by the tectonic forces of the Alpine mountain building event that was reshaping Central Europe at the time. And then, approximately 700 years ago, medieval miners found it. Not accidentally. They followed the surface brine springs that marked the places where the salt-bearing groundwater reached the surface, the same chemical signal that the Neolithic people of Romania had followed to the Lunca spring 6,000 years earlier. They dug downward, following the salt seam, cutting galleries through rock that had been deposited in a sea that no longer existed, in a landscape that looked nothing like the shallow tropical sea that had produced it. And what they found, at depth, was not simply salt. It was a world. The Wieliczka mine extends for approximately 300 kilometers of galleries across 9 levels, 300 kilometers of underground passages, chambers, lakes, and sculptures carved directly from the salt rock by miners who spent their working lives in the dark below the Polish plain. The mine contains chapels, chandeliers, life-size sculptures of historical and religious figures carved entirely from the grey-green salt rock by miners who were not artists by training, but who worked in a material so abundant and so workable that carving became, over the centuries, the natural expression of lives spent in intimate contact with it. 300 kilometers of galleries, 9 levels, underground chapels carved from salt. The deepest level sits 327 meters below the surface, the approximate height of the Eiffel Tower, inverted, descending into the earth below a city that has been built above it for 700 years without knowing, in most cases, that it sat above a world of carved salt and underground lakes, and the accumulated labor of generations of miners who went down in the dark and built something extraordinary from the mineral that an ancient sea left behind when it evaporated 13.5 million years ago. Your own skeleton contains approximately 1 kilogram of sodium, the primary ion in salt, distributed through the fluid in and around your cells and in the mineral matrix of your bones. 1 kilogram, the weight of a large apple, maintained in precise concentration by your kidneys, which filter your entire blood volume approximately 25 times per day, adjusting the salt concentration with a precision that your body cannot survive without. Your kidneys are running their own version of the Mediterranean's water balance, the same fundamental process of managing the concentration of dissolved salts in a body of water, preventing it from becoming either too dilute or too concentrated to sustain the chemistry of life. The Mediterranean managed its salt balance for millions of years before the tectonic forces of the African-European collision disrupted it. Your kidneys manage yours every moment of every day. Both systems, the same mineral, the same essential chemistry, running in the dark. Every city that sits beside a river mouth, a salt spring, or a coastal evaporation flat was put there by salt. Not in every case. Not without exception. But with a consistency that, once you begin looking for it in the historical record, becomes almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The pattern of early human settlement clustering around salt sources, the way iron filings cluster around a magnet, drawn not by the magnetism of geography, but by the magnetism of biological necessity. Every human body needs salt. Every human community needed a reliable source of it. And the communities that controlled a reliable source of salt did not simply survive. They prospered. They grew. They attracted other communities to trade with them. Communities that had things the salt producers needed, that would travel significant distances and accept unfavorable exchange rates to obtain the one thing they could not make themselves and could not live without. Salt was the first commodity. Before grain was traded in bulk quantities across long distances. Before metal moved from the mines of the mountains to the workshops of the cities. Before any of the complex, multi-commodity trade networks that characterized the ancient economies of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and East Asia had developed their full extent, salt was moving, being carried by people across distances that, given the transport technology of the time, represented extraordinary investment of effort and organization. The oldest road in Italy is a salt road. The Via Salaria, the salt road, runs from Rome to the Adriatic coast, a distance of approximately 240 kilometers, following a route that was already ancient when the Romans formalized it as a paved highway in the period of the Republic. Before the Romans paved it, it was a track. Before it was a track, it was a path. Before it was a path, it was the route that the Sabine people of central Italy had been walking for generations to reach the salt pans of the Adriatic coast and carry salt back to the communities of the interior that had no local source. 240 kilometers on foot. Carrying salt. The weight a person can comfortably carry over a long distance is approximately 20 to 25 kilograms. A round trip on the Via Salaria, to the coast and back, would take approximately 3 weeks on foot, carrying that load. 3 weeks of walking. For salt. Because without it, the food you carried on that 3-week walk would spoil before you returned home, the meat from the animals you slaughtered in autumn would rot before winter was over, and the bodies of everyone in your community would begin to fail in ways that the people of the ancient world could observe. The cramping, the weakness, the confusion, without understanding the chemistry behind them. They walked because they had to, and the path they walked became the road. And the road became the route along which other things moved. Merchants following the established path, because the path was known, and the distances between water sources were mapped, and the communities along the way were already accustomed to travelers. And the communities along the way grew because travelers needed food and shelter, and the merchants who followed the salt traders brought other goods that the communities wanted. And the city of Rome, sitting at the point where the Via Salaria met the Tiber River, the point where salt from the coast could be transferred from foot transport to boat transport and distributed upriver, grew wealthy enough to build an empire. The empire that built the roads grew from a salt route. Your salary comes from salt. Not metaphorically. Etymologically. The Latin word salarium, the word from which the English salary derives, referred to the payment made to Roman soldiers, either directly in salt or in money sufficient to buy salt. The specific mechanism is debated, whether Roman soldiers were paid in actual salt or in the money to purchase it, but the connection between salt and payment is embedded in the Latin language at a depth that suggests it predates the debate. The soldier's value was measured in the mineral that kept him alive, that preserved his food in the field, that allowed him to march and fight and maintain the physical capacity that made him useful to the state that employed him. You are paid in the legacy of salt. Every wage, every salary, every payment for work, in every language that derives from Latin, in every economy that traces its commercial vocabulary to the Roman world, carries in its etymology the memory of the mineral that was once the standard of value, the substance against which worth was measured, the thing that a person's labor was reckoned to be worth in the markets of the ancient world. Detectives looking at the salt trade routes of the ancient world mapped a network that, in its extent and its economic significance, rivals the silk routes of Central Asia and the spice routes of the Indian Ocean. Salt moved from the coastal salt pans of the Mediterranean to the interior cities of Europe and the Middle East. From the Himalayan salt mines of what is now Pakistan, the Kura mine, the second largest salt mine in the world, where the pink salt of the Himalayan seabed has been extracted since at least the 13th century, to the cities of the Indus Plain. From the salt lakes of the Sahara to the cities of West Africa, carried by camel caravans across 1,000 kilometers of desert. The Saharan salt caravans. In the medieval period, between approximately the 8th and 16th centuries, the trans-Saharan salt trade was one of the most economically significant long-distance trades in the world. Salt from the mines of Tagaza and Timbuktu, mines sitting in the middle of the Sahara, in some of the most hostile and inaccessible terrain on Earth, was transported by camel caravans south to the kingdoms of West Africa, where it was exchanged, at rates that made the mathematics of the exchange almost incomprehensible to the merchants of other regions who first encountered it, for gold. Salt for gold. Weight for weight. The kingdoms of the Sahel, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, controlled the southern end of the trans-Saharan trade and grew wealthy enough on the proceeds to build cities of scholarship and architecture that astonished the Arab travelers who visited them. The city of Timbuktu, at the height of the Mali Empire in the 14th century, was one of the wealthiest and most learned cities in the world, home to approximately 100,000 people, containing one of the most significant libraries in the medieval world, sustained by a trade in salt and gold that flowed across the Sahara in both directions on the backs of camels that had been bred specifically for the desert crossing. 100,000 people, in the middle of medieval Africa, built on salt. The camel caravans that sustained Timbuktu crossed the Sahara on routes that were mapped by the position of water sources, wells and springs and seasonal pools, spaced at distances that a loaded camel could cover between drinks. A Bactrian camel can carry approximately 250 kilograms of cargo and travel up to 40 kilometers per day in desert conditions. A caravan of 1,000 camels, a modest size for the major trans-Saharan routes, could carry 250 tons of salt per crossing. 250 tons per caravan crossing, across the largest desert on Earth, without roads, without mechanical transport, without any infrastructure except the knowledge of where the water was and the endurance of the animals that had been bred for exactly this journey. Your own body regulates its salt content through a mechanism of extraordinary sensitivity, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, a hormonal cascade that monitors the salt concentration of your blood and responds within minutes to deviations from the target range. When your blood sodium drops, through sweating, through insufficient dietary salt intake, through any of the dozens of circumstances that can displace the body's salt balance, your kidneys release renin. Renin triggers the production of angiotensin. Angiotensin triggers the release of aldosterone from the adrenal glands above your kidneys. Aldosterone instructs the kidney tubules to retain sodium rather than excreting it. The system closes the loop. The entire cascade, from the detection of low sodium to the conservation of sodium by the kidney, takes minutes. The camel caravan crossing the Sahara takes weeks. Both are moving salt from where it is to where it is needed. Both are running a logistics system calibrated to the minimum necessary to keep the organism or the city alive. Both are doing the patient, continuous, unremarkable work of maintaining the salt balance that life, biological life, economic life, civilizational life, depends on. Now consider what salt actually did to make all of this possible. What physical property of sodium chloride made it worth walking 240 kilometers to obtain, made it worth crossing the Sahara by camel, made it worth fighting wars and building empires and carving the word into the etymology of payment itself? It stops time. Not literally, but in the most practically significant sense available to a civilization that had no refrigeration, no canning, no vacuum sealing, no preservative chemistry beyond what the natural world provided. Salt stopped the biological clock of organic material. It prevented the microbial decomposition that would otherwise convert a slaughtered animal's flesh into poison within days. It preserved fish caught in summer for consumption in winter. It made olives edible that were otherwise unbearably bitter. It transformed milk into cheese that could be transported and stored for months. It turned the perishable abundance of a good harvest into the stable, portable, long-duration food supply that allowed people to travel, to trade, to survive the winter, to maintain armies in the field, to build cities far from the food sources that fed them. Salt was the original preservative technology, and its mechanism is the same mechanism that the bee uses in honey, the reduction of water activity in the preserved material to a level at which microbial growth cannot proceed. Salt draws water out of the cells of any organism that contacts it, through osmosis, reducing the water content of the food and simultaneously raising the salt concentration in the remaining water to levels that most microorganisms cannot tolerate. The food desiccates. The microbes that would decompose it cannot function. The food is preserved. Salt preserved the Roman legion's rations in the field. Salt preserved the fish that fed medieval Europe through the winter. Salt preserved the meat that fed the sailors who mapped the world's coastlines. Every voyage of exploration was a salt story. Every expedition into unknown territory carried salted provisions. Every navy that projected power across the oceans of the early modern world was sustained by the salted fish and salted meat that the salt trade made possible. Preserved food that could survive months at sea without spoiling, that could keep a crew of 50 or 100 men alive on a crossing that lasted longer than any fresh food could remain edible. The world was mapped by salt-preserved food. And tonight, in your kitchen, in the food you ate today that reached your plate through a supply chain that still uses salt as a preservative in many of its stages, in the cheese, the bread, the cured meat, the tinned goods, the prepared food that modern food technology continues to salt even though refrigeration has reduced the necessity, the same chemistry is running. The same osmotic mechanism, the same water activity reduction, the same ancient technology of preservation that the Neolithic people of Romania first applied to their food 6,000 years ago, that the Roman legions carried in their packs, that crossed the Sahara on the backs of camels. Still working, in your food, in your cells, in the quiet, continuous, below-conscious regulation of your blood salt content that your kidneys perform without any input from you, every moment of every day, maintaining the precise saline environment in which your biology can do what it has always done. Persist. The world your ancestors built was a world organized around this mineral. Every road, every city, every salary, every preserved meal that made a long journey possible, every army that held an empire together, every caravan that crossed a desert, all of it organized around the biological fact that you carry in your blood right now, the fact that you are salt water, that your cells demand it, that without it, nothing in you works, and with it, everything does. Your breathing is slower now than when we began. The thoughts that were sharp at the surface of your mind have dissolved slightly, the way salt dissolves in water, not disappearing but dispersing, becoming part of the medium rather than a distinct object in it. That is what is happening to the day. It is dissolving into the salt water of tonight. Every government that has ever controlled a salt supply has been tempted to tax it. Not occasionally. Not as an emergency measure in times of fiscal crisis. Systematically. Continuously. With the specific, calculated ruthlessness of a state that has identified the one commodity its population cannot refuse to purchase, and has decided to extract from that necessity the maximum revenue the population can bear without open revolt. Salt taxes are as old as organized states. The Chinese salt monopoly, the oldest and most sustained state control of salt in recorded history, dates to approximately 700 BCE, when the state of Qi first established the principle that salt production and distribution was not a private matter but a state function, to be regulated, taxed, and where possible monopolized by the government for its own revenue. That principle, the state's right to control salt, survived in Chinese governance, in various forms and under various dynasties, for approximately 2,700 years. 2,700 years of salt taxation. From 700 BCE to the final abolition of the Chinese salt monopoly in the early 20th century, the salt tax contributed, in most Chinese dynasties, between 30 and 50% of total government revenue. Between a third and a half of everything the Chinese imperial government spent on its armies, its bureaucracy, its infrastructure, its palaces, its ceremonies, was paid for by taxing the one mineral that every person in the empire consumed every day of their lives. The greatest empire in the world ran on salt tax. And the people who paid it were not the wealthy merchants or the landowning aristocracy, the classes that had sufficient political influence to obtain exemptions and reduced rates and the other accommodations that power has always made for itself at the expense of those without it. The people who paid the Chinese salt tax at its most burdensome rates were the people who could least afford it: the rural poor, the peasant farmers, the urban laborers whose diet consisted primarily of grain and vegetables that required salt for palatability and preservation, who had no alternative to purchasing salt from the state monopoly at the price the state chose to set. The salt tax was a tax on poverty. It was structured, in China and in every other state that imposed it, to extract the most revenue from the people with the least capacity to pay, because those people were also the people with the least capacity to resist. They could not refuse to buy salt. They could not produce their own outside the monopoly without facing severe punishment. They could not find substitutes. They could only pay, or risk the consequences of being found with untaxed salt, consequences that, in some periods of Chinese history, included execution. The monster of the salt tax is not its fiscal mechanism. It is its function as a system of extraction calibrated precisely to the biological necessity of the taxed population. The salt tax is the state looking at the human body's requirement for sodium, the irreducible, non-negotiable, death follows deficiency requirement, and deciding to charge admission, to place a toll on a biological function, to monetize the gap between survival and its absence. This is the catastrophe that salt enabled. Not the geological catastrophe of an evaporating sea, not the human catastrophe of a destroyed salt supply, but the political catastrophe of a mineral so essential that it could be used as an instrument of control over entire populations for thousands of years, with the population's own biology as the enforcement mechanism. You cannot withhold the sodium your neurons need. The state knew this, and used it. The French gabelle, the salt tax that operated in France from approximately the 14th century until the French Revolution, was, in the specific form it took in the century before 1789, one of the most hated and most unjust fiscal instruments in European history. Not simply because it was high, though it was high, adding a tax burden that multiplied the price of salt by factors of 6 to 10 in some regions, but because it was systematically unequal. Different regions of France paid different rates. Some regions paid almost nothing. Others, particularly in the north, paid rates so extreme that the salt tax alone consumed a significant fraction of a poor family's annual income. And not only were they required to pay the tax, they were required to purchase a minimum quantity of salt per person per year, the sel du devoir, the duty salt, whether they needed it or not, whether they could afford it or not, whether the harvest had been good or bad, whether the winter had been mild or cruel, whether the family had lost a member since the previous year's assessment or not. The minimum purchase was assessed per head, and the tax collector arrived each year to ensure compliance. The French poor were legally required to buy a commodity they were simultaneously taxed to the edge of affordability for purchasing. Detectives looking at the records of the French salt tax in the decade before the Revolution revealed that the gabelle generated approximately 60 million livres per year for the royal treasury, approximately 6% of total government revenue in a kingdom whose fiscal system was simultaneously failing to meet its obligations and extracting the maximum possible revenue from the population least able to provide it. The salt tax did not cause the revolution alone, but it was among the most visceral of the grievances that the delegates of the Third Estate carried to Versailles in 1789, not as an abstraction or a political principle, but as a specific, daily, physically experienced injustice that had been taking money from the mouths of poor families for 400 years. The gabelle was abolished in 1790, one of the first acts of the revolutionary government. The most consequential salt tax story in the modern world happened in India. On the 12th of March 1930, Mohandas Gandhi walked out of his ashram at Sabarmati with 78 followers. He walked toward the sea. The walk, the Dandi March, named for the coastal village on the Arabian Sea where it ended 24 days later, covered approximately 385 kilometers through the Gujarat countryside, gathering followers at each village along the route, watched by journalists from newspapers across the world, reported to an international audience that was, in many cases, encountering the specific injustice of the British salt tax in India for the first time. The British had imposed a salt monopoly on India that made it illegal for any Indian to produce or sell salt outside the government's licensed channels, at a price that included a tax burden that fell, as salt taxes always fall, most heavily on the poorest. In a country where salt was essential not only for the human body but for the preservation of the food that the majority of the population depended on, and where the majority of the population lived in poverty, the salt tax extracted a disproportionate share of the income of those least able to pay it. On the 6th of April 1930, Gandhi reached the sea at Dandi. He picked up a small lump of natural salt from the beach, salt that the tide had deposited on the shore, salt that had been there since before the British arrived, salt that belonged to the ocean and to anyone who needed it, and by picking it up, he broke the law. The act was simple, almost absurdly simple. A 70-year-old man, who weighed approximately 46 kilograms, roughly the weight of a large bag of animal feed, bending to pick up salt from a beach. It changed the world. Not immediately. Not through any single mechanism that can be traced in a straight line from that moment to Indian independence 17 years later, but by demonstrating, with a clarity that required no translation across cultural or linguistic boundaries, the specific character of the injustice it was protesting. The image of a man picking up salt from the sea that had always produced salt, that produced salt for every coastline on Earth, that had been producing salt since before the first human being walked beside it, and being told by a government that this act was illegal, that the salt belonged not to the ocean or to the people who needed it, but to the administrative system that had decided to tax it. That image communicated something that hours of political argument could not. You cannot own salt. The ocean makes it. The sun evaporates the water. The mineral crystallizes on the shore. It belongs to the chemistry of the planet, not to any government that arrives and draws a line around it and calls it revenue. Your body agrees. Your kidneys do not ask permission to regulate your sodium. Your neurons do not pay a toll to fire their salt-mediated signals. Your cells do not apply for a license to maintain their electrochemical gradients. The salt in your body arrived there through the food you ate, and before that through the soil that grew the food, and before that through the rain that dissolved it from the rock, and before that through the geological processes that deposited it in the rock in the first place, a chain of natural transfer so ancient and so continuous that the idea of any human institution owning a link in it is, from the perspective of the chemistry, simply incorrect. The salt was never owned. It was only, for a period of human history, controlled. And that control, the moment when a state decided to turn biological necessity into a revenue mechanism, produced, as every such moment eventually produces, the resistance that dismantled it. The French Revolution, the Indian independence movement, the hundreds of smaller, less remembered moments when people who had been taxed on their salt found a way to make their own, to trade outside the monopoly, to walk to the sea and pick up what the tide left. Detectives looking at the records of salt smuggling in pre-revolutionary France revealed that the faux sonneurs, the illegal salt traders, the people who moved untaxed salt across the borders between high-tax and low-tax regions, were among the most numerous criminal class in 18th century France. Tens of thousands of people, by some estimates, operating in networks that stretched across hundreds of kilometers, carrying salt in hidden compartments in wagons, in false-bottomed barrels, sewn into the lining of clothing, in the stomachs of animals driven across tax boundaries, at risk of punishment that included, for repeat offenders, imprisonment in the galleys. 4. Salt. The human capacity to resist a system that charges for a biological necessity is, the historical record suggests, robust. It takes time. It takes the accumulation of grievance across generations. It takes a moment, a march to the sea, a storming of a palace, a quiet act of defiance in the salt pans at dawn, that crystallizes the grievance into action. But it comes. Because the thing being taxed is not a luxury, not a preference, not a comfort that can be surrendered with difficulty, but ultimately without fatal consequence. It is salt, and the body knows what the body needs. Your body knows right now. Not urgently. You are not salt-depleted, not in the condition of deficiency that the historical record describes in populations that were. You are warm, still, lying in the dark, your kidneys quietly managing your sodium balance with the same precision they have maintained all day, the same precision they will maintain all night while you sleep. The system is not under pressure tonight. It is simply running, as it has always run, as it ran in the bodies of the people who walked the Via Salaria, and the miners who descended into Wyalikska, and the followers who walked with Gondi to the sea. The same system, the same mineral, the same essential, non-negotiable, body is made of it requirement that has shaped human history from the first salt spring to the last salt tax. Running quietly, in the dark of your cells, without requiring anything of you except what you are already giving it. Rest. There is a neuron firing in your brain right now because of salt. Not metaphorically. Not as a loose connection between a mineral and a biological process that share a name or a category. Literally, the electrical signal moving through your nervous system at this moment, the signal that is carrying the last waking thoughts of a mind approaching sleep, is powered by the movement of sodium ions across the membrane of a neuron. Sodium ions. Salt ions. The same charged particles that dissolved from ancient rock into the ancient ocean, that the first cells learned to pump across their membranes to generate the electrical gradients they needed to function, that your nervous system inherited from those first cells across 4 billion years of unbroken biological succession. The thought you are having right now is a salt event. Every thought you have ever had has been a salt event. The action potential, the electrical signal that carries information through your nervous system, works by a mechanism that has been understood in its molecular detail since the 1950s, when Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley worked out the mathematics of how a nerve signal propagates along an axon. Their model, which won the Nobel Prize in 1963 and which every neuroscience textbook still begins with, describes a wave of sodium ions rushing into the neuron through specialized protein channels in the membrane, driven by both the electrical gradient and the concentration gradient across the membrane, reversing the local charge from negative to positive in a fraction of a millisecond, then the sodium channels closing and potassium channels opening, potassium rushing out, the charge, reversing back toward negative, the wave propagating along the axon to the next node, the next channel, the next rush of sodium. The nerve signal is a salt wave, moving at speeds of between 0.5 and 120 meters per second through your nervous system, from the sensory receptors in your skin to the spinal cord, from the spinal cord to the brain, from one region of the brain to another, from the brain back out through the motor neurons to the muscles. Every signal in your nervous system is a salt wave, a precisely controlled movement of sodium ions across a membrane, repeated at node after node along every axon in your body, billions of times per second, every second of every day of your life. Billions of salt events per second, running in your body right now. And what those salt events are doing right now, in this specific moment, as your breathing has already slowed and the weight of your body has already begun to settle more completely into the surface beneath you, is different from what they were doing an hour ago. The frequency of firing in your arousal systems, the neural circuits that maintain wakefulness, that keep your brain in the high-frequency, high-amplitude electrical activity of conscious awareness, is decreasing. The sodium channels are opening less often. The salt waves are arriving less frequently. The signals that were sustaining the sharp, quick, demanding activity of the waking brain are slowing, spacing out, finding the longer intervals between them that characterize the transition towards sleep. Your salt is slowing. This is not a malfunction. It is the most essential maintenance process your nervous system performs, the nightly reduction of its own activity from the rate required for wakefulness to the rate required for restoration, the rate that allows the glymphatic system to begin its clearance, the rate that allows the memory consolidation systems to do their patient work, the rate that allows the billions of sodium channels that have been opening and closing at full speed all day to slow their cycling, to allow the ion pumps that maintain the gradients across the membranes to restore the balance that the day's activity has displaced. The sodium-potassium ATPase pump, the molecular machine embedded in every neuron's membrane that actively pumps sodium out and potassium in, spending ATP to maintain the gradient that makes the action potential possible, has been working all day. All day, continuously, at every node of every axon, spending the energy currency of your cells to maintain the electrochemical gradient that the salt wave depletes with every firing. Tonight, as the firing slows, the pump catches up, restores the gradient, refills the reservoir, prepares the neuron for tomorrow's signals, for tomorrow's thoughts, for tomorrow's salt waves carrying tomorrow's experience through the same channels, along the same axons, to the same brain that is, right now, letting the current day's signals slow toward silence. Detectives looking at the sodium-potassium ATPase pump revealed that it is one of the most ancient proteins in biology, present in bacteria, in archaea, in every complex organism that has ever been studied. Its basic structure has been conserved across 4 billion years of evolution with a fidelity that marks it as one of the most fundamentally important molecular machines life has ever developed. It is the molecular foundation of the action potential, of the nerve signal, of the electrical activity of every nervous system that has ever existed. It is the molecular foundation of thought itself, and it runs on salt, on the precise concentration difference between sodium inside the cell and sodium outside it, on the gradient that the pump creates and maintains, on the electrochemical potential energy stored in that gradient, the same principle as the proton gradient across the mitochondrial membrane that we encountered in the deep ocean, the same fundamental thermodynamic logic of a concentration difference across a barrier providing the energy that drives biological work. Salt is the energy storage medium of your nervous system. The gradient is the battery. The action potential is the discharge. And you have been discharging and recharging that battery with every thought, every sensation, every movement, every moment of conscious awareness since you woke this morning. The sodium-potassium ATPase pump has been spending your cellular energy, your ATP, the currency that your mitochondria produce from the glucose that the bees' pollination made possible, to maintain the gradient that every salt wave depletes. Every thought costs salt gradients. Every sensation costs salt gradients. Every decision, every memory, every emotional response costs salt gradients. And tonight, the cost of the day is sitting in you, not as a feeling of deficiency, not as a detectable depletion that any instrument you possess could measure, but as the accumulated weight of a billion salt events spread across the day that have brought you to this moment, to the slowdown, to the spacing of the signals, to the specific, quiet, dark, heavy feeling of a nervous system that has done its day's work and is beginning, cell by cell and channel by channel and ion by ion, to let the gradient restore itself. The salt is returning to its place, across every membrane in your nervous system, pumped back to the outside of every neuron that fired today, restoring the negative resting potential, preparing the channels, charging the battery that tomorrow's thoughts will spend. Your body knows how to do this, has always known. It has been doing it every night of your life, charging the salt batteries in the dark, in the quiet, in the specific stillness that the restoration requires. The same restoration that the salt mines of Wyalikska perform over geological time, the slow, patient accumulation of mineral into stable form, layer by layer, in the dark below the surface, building something durable from the slow deposition of what the water carries. You and the salt mine are both charging in the dark, both depositing, both restoring, both doing the patient, below conscious, maintenance level work that tomorrow's use will require. Now follow the salt one step further, out of your neurons and into the water your body is made of. The approximately 37 liters of fluid that your cells and your blood and your interstitial spaces contain, the fluid that maintains the chemical environment in which every biological process in your body operates, that carries the dissolved salts that your cells require, that transports the nutrients and the waste products and the hormones and the signals between every organ and every tissue in your body. That fluid is salt water. Specifically, it is a salt solution maintained at approximately 0.9% sodium chloride by mass, the concentration that biological chemists call normal saline, and that hospitals use in intravenous drips when a patient's fluid balance needs to be restored. Normal saline. The normal concentration of salt in the fluid your body considers its baseline, the concentration that your kidneys maintain hour by hour, day by day, across every fluid loss and every fluid intake of your life. 0.9%. The ocean's current salt concentration is approximately 3.5%, several times more concentrated than your blood. But the early ocean, in the period when the first complex cells were developing the biochemistry that your cells still run, may have had a significantly lower salt concentration, closer, some researchers have argued, to the concentration your body now maintains internally. The salt concentration of the ancient ocean in which your cellular biochemistry was first assembled may be preserved in the salt concentration of your blood, a 4 billion-year-old memory of the water your ancestors lived in, maintained by your kidneys as the precise chemical environment in which your biology can function. Your blood remembers the ancient ocean. Point 32. And the ancient ocean, in the geological record that the Messinian salinity crisis left in 3 kilometers of evaporite deposits on the floor of the Mediterranean, remembers itself, the specific chemistry of a sea that evaporated and crystallized and was buried and deformed and is still moving through the crust above it in salt domes that trap.